I was hoping to have Amy and Ella here with me, please. Thank you. This is Amy, daughter, and this is Ella, daughter. Thank you. I just need you here for a minute because this is a tough film for Amy to watch and probably for Ella to watch. It was a long and tough shoot. But for me today, I'm here in front of you, not as a producer, but as a mother. And I'm representing the mothers of all the children of the planet today. I just want to enclose everybody in my heart today, because it feels to me as the children of our planet right now are facing a very uncertain and scary future. The climate is threatened, we're threatened with nuclear challenges, you name it. And I'm wondering how we're going to shift this. How are we going to find direction and hope and inspiration at a time when the world seems to be spiraling into chaos? And it's a very angry world where hatred of the other is really prevalent. Unfortunately, our leaders who we've elected to look after us are not necessarily handling this anywhere in the world. We really don't have direction. We don't have leadership. We don't have light. And then I think about who's here in the room. I think about the journalists, the filmmakers, the artists, the writers, the photographers, the agents, the producers, the beautiful producer Una Jackman, who is here tonight, who literally stood by us from day one and is still standing by us. And Una, we love you so, so much. I look at you people, and I think about how you are the ones, you with the power of media, you with the power of storytelling, are the ones who can guide us to the light. You can choose stories that are solutions oriented. You can choose heroes that are positive figures. You can tell us things that will make us believe that there is the possibility of light somewhere out there at the end of this torturous tunnel. So really, as this mother, on behalf of all mothers, I appeal to you to really sort of, on the words of St. Francis of Assisi, where there is chaos, let us seek to find peace. Where there is anger, let us tell stories of forgiveness. And where there is hatred, let us all work towards finding love. And together, through the power of media, we can transform the pain of this world into something positive and loving in the hearts of all human beings, wherever they are. Thank you. Let's try it. Thank you, Ella, thank you. And we're going to get Dan Thomas and John. This is not going to be a panel. I hate panels, okay? So, John, it's over to you to have a conversation, all right? And we're going to include them as soon as possible.
Okay, well, that was a really powerful film and very painful for those of us who are journalists to watch. And I didn't know Dan, but I knew Hansi, who was my colleague at the AP, and he was a very wonderful, generous, and giving human being. So difficult to watch, but Kathy, all congratulations to you for getting this wonderful film made. And Dan, maybe I can start with you a little bit. This is Dan Thomas from UNICEF. He's a former Reuters correspondent in Nairobi, so you know the milieu. How realistic do you think this film was?
Thank you. I love this film. It's the second time I've seen it. Congratulations to Kathy and everyone involved in making it. I was working at Reuters at the same time as Dan Eldon, and very much the same sort of age, the same sort of a group of young people coming into the profession. I was actually in Hong Kong when he was killed and our colleagues were killed. It was a very dark day in the history of Reuters. First time so many journalists have been killed in one incident, and really kind of, I think made us all realize what a dangerous job this was and how passionate these guys were about telling the story as they saw it.
Do you feel, Kathy, that the making of this movie will move people to think more in terms of dialogue as opposed to seeing things in black and white?
Oh, I love that, because I remember, Muhammad, it says it's all fucking, gray. It's not, there's nothing black, there's nothing white. The Somalis weren't bad, they were bad. What are we doing around the world? I would hope so. I would hope so. And by the way, the person who deserves the credit for sticking with this is our director, Bronwyn Hughes, and every woman in film here. Bronwyn is the one who stuck with me for 16 years. She entered this midway. We started 24 years ago with this project, and I want to say to every one of you who's in the middle of something you really want to make happen, don't give up. There's a right time for it, and you have to listen to the criticism, but there's a right time. But you really nailed it, John. That's the intention. The complexity of it all. It's not black and white.
Dan, do you see anything from this film that you think is relevant to the conflicts we're experiencing now?
Yeah, I think it's clear that this shows how dangerous the profession is and was then. In some ways, I think there's a moment in the film where they start attacking the journalists, and I think that is where we're coming to now. Journalists are in a very, very dangerous situation. Often they are the people being attacked when they're still just trying to tell the story and to do what these guys do. And I think one of the other things I like about this film is how realistic it was. I mean, I was in that bureau. It looks exactly the same in the film as it used to then in the 1990s. And I felt, so many of these films about journalism are a bit hokey, they're a bit Hollywoody. This is, to my mind, a very realistic portrayal of what the trade is. I mean, we saw it very much as a trade in those days. It wasn't a profession. There was nothing really glamorous about it. People came into the business just by kind of being apprentices and learning on the job, as Dan did, the hard way. And it's a very realistic portrayal of the daily life of covering a war like that in Somalia.
It was interesting for me to remember the technology we used to work with, where we would convert bathrooms into dark rooms and send photos on cylinders. I can still remember the smell of the chemicals.
We blew up that cylinder, by the way. They plugged it in something. They did that, and then it was poof, gone.
But for those of you who aren't journalists, I think because of what happened to Dan and his colleagues in Somalia and the also killings of journalists in Bosnia in the 1990s around the same time, there has been a change in the culture of journalism. It's much more safety oriented now, for better or worse. News organizations tend to invest a lot more in trying to protect journalists, and there's also a movement afoot to create safer conditions for freelancers who often don't have the financial resources for things like hostile environment training and armored cars or even insurance for them. So I think the sacrifice of these young men, and they were very young, Dan especially, has slowly helped to change the thinking in journalism around safety and protecting in order to get the story. But
I have to say that right now journalists are threatened in other ways by being accused falsely of, as it were, fake news. I think that's another area where you're really under terrible threat. Maybe even not as insidious as being killed, but certainly it's something that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, that is really true. Well, Dan, how do you see it? as far as.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and in some ways it shows how important the profession, the trade of journalism really is, to get the story out, to report it with passion, with putting, these guys put their lives on the line, and increasingly they're, everybody's becoming a journalist as well. We're seeing, everyone's got a camera, and people are actually risking their lives still to tell the story, to get the word out about what's happening. We see this extraordinary, refugee crisis happening with the Rohingya refugees fleeing into Bangladesh, and it's so important to tell the story, of what's happening. There were some children's drawings, and I've seen, I'm now working at UNICEF. In the last week, I've seen drawings exactly the same as those drawings, which have been brought out and drawn by children fleeing from that crisis, where there were no cameras. So,
one of the people covering that particular crisis is Jeff Gettleman, and Jeff is now the New York Times bureau chief for Southeast Asia, and he was on the safari. He was one of the kids, and we've got AJ here somewhere who was on the safari as well. But that safari was transformative for the kids who were on it. Christopher Nolan, all of you women in film know who he is. Chris was on that safari. He took the films that he was a kid filmmaker at the time, but it was a transformative time for them to be on that safari. Amy was only 16 years old. She turned 16 on it. Eleanor Tatum, who is the bureau chief, the publisher of the Amsterdam News, she was on it as well. But the reason we made this film was not just to tell the story of journalists, or not just to tell the story of refugees, but to do a film that could literally inspire a movement, ignite light fires in people who would want to go out and say, hey, you know what, there's more. You know what, the life that I'm leading is great, but there is more, and I want to do more, be more, feel more, love more, give more. And that's what we're up to now. And that's where I'm so grateful for those of you who are here, is how do we enlist you in this army of transformation, and what do we do, and how do we get AP and Reuters and UNICEF and everybody connected. Dan said connection is the solution.
That's really true, how to live meaningfully. So, we'd like to hear some questions from the audience.
We have mics too, I think.
We have mics.
Yeah, there's a mic.
So just raise your hand if you have a question.
Yeah.
Right up here in
Come
front.
on, thank you, Richard. Richard mics.
Can I borrow this? Thank you all so much for this incredible film. I'm Richard Marks. I have a quick question about a theme in the film, which is about crossing the line. And it kept coming up in different scenes, especially the scene where the shooter from Reuters doesn't want to let Dan not shoot the dead body that's been skinned. And the line that haunted me sort of was when Dan's colleague says, well, you did the right thing by not shooting it. So I'm wondering if we can talk more broadly on this theme, Kathy, and yeah, about when can we cross the line? When can we tell the truth, or are we just telling the story for the sake of telling the story? How does the truth help us?
Right, that was the Scott Peterson character who said that to him. I think there is a general feeling among journalists that we're human beings first, and depending on the situation, it is sometimes better to turn the camera away and not to show. But many journalists go into this and they take these risks because they hope and believe that by showing the reality of what was happening in Mogadishu, or what was happening in Bosnia, or what's happening today in Myanmar, or in Thailand, that it will do some good in the end. So it really is a moral, ethical choice. But I've known many journalists who decided that it was more important to put the camera down and do something they could to help in that moment.
Just to say, John is actually senior vice president in charge of ethics and integrity and now standards at the Associated Press, after an incredibly illustrious career And we're very honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes, please.
This is not to diminish the achievement of the film, but I've lived in some of the countries that were discussed, and I've been to all of them, and it seems to me that there was a huge amount of naivete going in, of all concerned, of all, particularly the people in the caravans, and it did start with not a vacation, but a fun adventure. Let's do this.
This is a feature film. Can I
And,
just tell you?
and one more thing, there is ideology in many of the news reporters as well as the photographers' efforts. And ideology is not necessarily neutrality and objectivity, and that ought to be paid attention to too. It's not all fabulosity that they report the news from their point of view, which is not everyone's point of view, and it's not neutral.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity to answer that at the beginning of the question, because this is a feature film, and feature films are not documentaries. So Dan, when he was 17, just turning 18, drove down to South Africa with a friend and stumbled across a refugee camp, the one that we portray. And at that refugee camp, he discovered there were 14,000 people who didn't have water, and they didn't have basic anything. So he spent the next year in college setting up something called Student Transport Aid. They raised $17,000. One of the people is here in the room. The actual truth is totally different than what we portrayed there. The journey, there were 15 kids on safari. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was called Mission Mozambique, Student Transport Aid. So I'm really glad you asked that, because it kind of rankles me that it looks like they were all such like he wasn't like that at all. He was brought up in Africa. He was not a white kid saving Africa. He was an African who understood the challenges that the people were facing and identified with them and wanted to do something. So thank you so much for letting me clear that one up. That's really important. You can answer the one on ideology, okay?
Thank you. I think you do have a point that every human being comes into any situation with their own background and their own interpretations, and sometimes it's the job of the international correspondent to try to interpret one culture for another. And I think the best ones are sensitive and culturally aware and try to park their biases at the door.
I'll also say that Dan attended 4 colleges, lest you think he didn't want to go to college. So this is a condensation of 3 years of his life. And it's so damn hard to tell a story of somebody who, anybody. How do we tell a story in 2 hours, which is so complex, but such a good, thank you. Anybody else before we go out and, yeah. Right over there.
Hi, Kat. Hi.
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm so close to you, I want to hug you. My name is Sarah Mess, and I was there that day in Somalia, July 12th. And I don't sleep so good, so if I look a little tired, it's because I am. And I want to thank you all for this film. It's the closest piece of truth to that experience. And my question is, can I share a poem with you? Operation Restore Hope. It's not every day that you see a Somali woman with her children in a New Jersey pizzeria. She said that people often ask her if she's from the islands. Her eyes as bright as her smile. Somalia shining through her chocolate skin. Hair no longer laden with the parched winds of Africa, with the winds of a blow dryer. No textiles to robe her from her head to her feet. The Gap version of her former self. Assimilation. For becoming American, she pays through her children. Their tongue no longer her own. Iskawarin, I said. Ah, you know Somali? Her jaw drops. She searches for the answer in my fair skin and freckled arms as my son places a quarter in the gumball machine behind me. My son's gumball falls to the dirty floor. Oh no, she says. May he have another quarter? Sure. Thank you so much, I say. She places a quarter into my son's hand as I watch her son and daughter. And suddenly, all of the Somali children scream in my head, water, water, water. Fuck you, America. America, fuck you. And the guilt of hellfire raining on her people rips through my being, transporting me back to convoying full speed past begging children, heart pounding, blood racing under the facade of a humanitarian mission. My son pops the bright green gumball into his mouth. Peace had been restored to my unknowing American boy. That's Operation Restore Hope. And I believe you, and I believe Dan, when you say that we can use our gifts and our art as a voice of reflection, of understanding, and truth. So I thank you for everything. And Dan, and all the others. I don't really have the words. And I'm sorry it rings so hollow. But thank you for this work.
I guess that's why we needed to make the film. And Sarah was actually in the field hospital. She wrote to me on Facebook. She found out that we were showing the film, and she said I was in the hospital when Dan's body came back. So I'm so honored to have you, Sarah, and you're such an extraordinary poet and person, and we're so grateful. I can't wait to know you much better. I see one back there.
Yes, one back there.
There's a mic coming.
I want to thank you for this film, and I'm very sorry for what happened to your son. It's a tragic thing to happen to a young person, and he was a very brave person to do what he was doing. I've always admired journalists who do this kind of work. It takes a lot of guts, and thank God we see something that's happening that our country does in other countries. My question is about before Reagan. There was a time when journalists went out without being embedded into, the convoys and stuff. And afterwards, please correct me, but are there not more deaths since they have been embedded? And what could we do so that we still have independent journalism that is not affected? You know, when you're embedded with an army or with a bunch of guys, you don't want to say, oh, you're killing those people over there. Do you understand what I'm saying? What can we do, or at this point, is there a step forward since this law that journalists have to be embedded with the forces? How can that, you know, and has there been more deaths? I heard there was more deaths. And why is that?
Well, I think most of the journalists who die every year are local journalists, and it's about 50 to 75 journalists a year around the world, working in their own countries often. And I think you're under a misimpression that all journalists are embedded. There are situations, wartime situations, where the only way to get to a story is to be with an armed force. Like, for instance, in Raqqa today, the journalists who went in with Kurdish forces. But there are many journalists who operate independently outside of embedded situations. Again, it is unusual for the Western journalists to be killed these days. Usually it's local journalists and freelance journalists who bear the highest cost, such as the woman in Malta last week, the investigative reporter whose car was blown up. So, Dan?
The only thing I would add to that is that journalism has to be supported. I mean, we can get all kinds of news and fake news on the internet, but the proper journalism, independent journalism, it needs to be supported. And so many websites, so many news organizations who ask directly, are increasingly asking for that support from their readers. That, if you value the information, you value the reporting that we do, then you need to support that by contributing, by paying for it. And I think that in this World Wide Web internet age, increasingly people are going to have to pay for what they value.
One more. Yes. Oh, good, Yashi Brown.
Thank you so much for just all the work that you do, but I never asked you this question. This film is a work of art in every sort of way. So the graphics, the visuals, can you explain a little bit more the minds that went into that and how that became part of the story?
Thank you, good question. This one, there's a book. You saw Dan playing with journals, working on his journals all the time. After he was killed, we discovered 20 journals all over the world in people's attics and cupboards and closets, and they were packed with that art. That was real art. And when Bronwyn thought about the film, she wanted to make it a sort of a collage, so it kind of darts around, but she also wanted to bring it alive through the art. So she worked with a really fantastic group in South Africa who did the graphics. So that was all done in South Africa. Our producer, one of our prime producers, is Kwaku Mandela, Nelson Mandela's grandson. And I said, why are you doing this, Kwaku? And he said, I want to show that being African has nothing to do with the color of your skin. So, Dan was brought up with an African mentality for sure. So that was the intention. I think it enlivens the project. That the music was done not in South Africa, but everything else was done in South Africa. And the filming, every single shot except for the bits in London, were within an hour and a half of Johannesburg. And the people I got closest to were the Somali extras, by the way. It was a really extraordinary healing time for them and for me. Okay, what do you think?
Thank you very much. Congratulations to you and your collaborators for making this wonderful and important film. So,
thank you. It's the collaborators. Thank you. All about that.
Thank you.